The first warning came quiet, almost polite. The way men speak when they still hope you'll listen. "Don't touch that," the old woman said, her voice thin but steady, eyes never leaving the rancher's hand as it hovered inches from the cloth-wrapped object on the table. The room had gone still, too still, like the air before a gunshot. Dust motes hung frozen in the lamplight of the trading post. And every man inside knew something was wrong, even if they didn't yet know why. The rancher, Caleb Hart, was used to silence bending around him. 6'4", shoulders carved by years of reins and rifle stock, eyes like weathered iron. He'd buried cattle, men and memories out on his land. He didn't scare easy, and he didn't like being told what not to do, especially not by a town that had taken from him quietly for years. Caleb's fingers twitched. He felt it then, that familiar tightening in his chest that always came before trouble. The old woman swallowed. "Some things don't belong to any man," she whispered. A few folks shifted. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered a prayer. Caleb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Funny," he said, voice low and calm, "because everything I've got was taken first." And with that, he pulled the cloth away. The reaction was instant. Chairs scraped back. A glass shattered. One man cursed out loud. Another backed toward the door like he'd just seen the devil blink. Beneath the cloth lay a small iron-bound box, no bigger than a saddlebag. Scarred by age and etched with symbols most folks pretended not to recognize. Every child in town had heard stories about it. Every adult knew better than to ask. The box had been found years ago, buried beneath the old church. Foundation after the fire no one liked to talk about. The fire that killed 7 people. The fire the town swore was an accident. Caleb felt the weight of every eye on him. He could feel their fear, sharp and sour. It tasted familiar. "You said don't touch it," he said, fingers brushing the cold metal. "You never said why." The old woman's lips trembled. "Because the last man who opened it lost everything," she said. Caleb's jaw tightened. He thought of his wife's grave, of the child that never drew breath, of land taxes raised until men like him were forced to sell piece by piece. "Then he and I have something in common already," Caleb replied. Outside, the town bell began to ring, not for church, not for fire, but for warning. Someone had run ahead. Word spread fast in places like this, and fear spread faster. By the time Caleb stepped back onto the wooden porch of the trading post, half the town was already gathering, faces pale, voices rising. "What did you do?" Someone shouted. "Put it back," another yelled. A man pushed through the crowd, red-faced and sweating, the mayor, Thomas Kellen, a man who'd never worked land but owned plenty of it. "I told you not to get involved with that thing," Kellen hissed. "You don't own it." Caleb turned slowly. "Then who does?" he asked. The mayor didn't answer. That was answer enough. Caleb lifted the box so all could see. "I buried a wife on this soil," he said loudly. "Paid my taxes. Bled for this land. If there's something here that belongs to this town, then it belongs to me, too." A murmur rolled. Through the crowd, anger braided with fear. Someone threw a rock. It missed, but the message didn't. Caleb saw it then. This wasn't about a box. It never had been. It was about control. About secrets. About who paid the price so others could sleep easy. That night, torches burned along Main Street. Windows shuttered. Doors locked. Caleb rode back to his ranch under a moon that looked sharp enough to cut skin. The box sat heavy in his saddlebag like it knew it had been moved. Halfway home, his horse spooked hard, nearly throwing him. Caleb steadied the reins, heart pounding. He'd crossed Apache territory. Drought, rustlers, and war. But this felt different. Wrong. At the ranch, he locked the box inside the old root cellar, the one his wife used to keep preserves in. He stood there a long time, lantern shaking in his hand, listening to the wind scrape across the plains. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried. Or maybe it was something else. By morning, the town had decided. They rode out in a line, 20 men, rifles slung, faces hard. Not lawmen, neighbors, friends once. The mayor rode at the front. When they reached Caleb's gate, they didn't knock. Kellen called out, voice tight with forced authority. "Bring the box back. This ends now." Caleb stepped onto his porch, shotgun resting against his leg. It ends when the truth comes out, he replied. You don't want that? Kellen's eyes flickered. You have no idea what you've started. Caleb looked past them, at the horizon where his land stretched red and endless. Then you shouldn't have told me not to touch it. As the standoff hardened, the truth began to crack through whispered threats and shaking hands. The box wasn't cursed, it was proof, deeds, names, blood-stained, agreements made after the church fire, land stolen, lives traded, the town's prosperity built on silence. Caleb hadn't just enraged them by touching what was forbidden, he'd reminded them of what they'd buried, and buried things don't stay quiet forever. As the sun climbed, rifles rose. One wrong move would turn neighbors into killers. Caleb squared his shoulders, heart steady now. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't back down. Some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed, and the town was about to learn the cost of telling the wrong man. Don't touch that. If you're drawn into stories where one choice changes everything, where the Wild West isn't just guns and dust, but secrets and consequences, make sure you subscribe to this channel. These are the stories history tried to bury, and we're just getting started. The first shot didn't come from Caleb Hart's porch. It came from the crowd, wild and panicked, fired by a boy barely old enough to shave, and that single mistake shattered whatever fragile line still existed between warning and war. The bullet tearing through the dirt at Caleb's feet as 20 rifles came up at once, and the rancher's world narrowed to breath, trigger, and truth, because in that moment he understood something the town did not. They were already damned, whether he lived or died, because the box had been opened and what lived inside. It could not be locked away again, not by fear, not by threats, not by blood, and as Caleb raised his shotgun, not to fire, but to steady himself, the mayor shouted for order too late. Chaos blooming like wildfire across dry grass as men screamed and horses reared and the past came charging, forward with teeth bared. And above it all, Caleb's voice cut sharp and commanding. Stand down, he roared, a rancher's shout that had stopped stampedes and broken men alike. And for a heartbeat, the town hesitated, long enough for him to kick the cellar door open and drag the iron box into the sun, flinging it onto the dirt where it burst apart with a sound like a coffin cracking open, papers scattering in the wind, deeds and contracts, and signed confessions weighted with wax, seals and dried blood. Names everyone knew and crimes everyone pretended not to remember, and the silence that followed was worse than gunfire, because recognition spread across faces. One by one as neighbors read their own histories written in ink. They could no longer deny land seized after the church fire, witnesses paid or threatened into silence, families driven out or buried, the mayor's signature everywhere like a sickness, and Kellen stumbled back as if struck, his authority collapsing in on itself. While men looked from the pages to their own hands, realizing they weren't protecting the town, they were protecting a lie. And when the first woman stepped forward, tears cutting clean tracks, threw dust on her face as she whispered her father's name from a page dated the year he disappeared, something broke wide open, grief spilling into rage, rage into truth, until the rifles lowered not toward Caleb but toward the men who had fed them fear for decades. And Kellen tried to speak, but his voice failed him as the crowd closed in, not violent yet, just relentless. The way justice moves when it's been starved too long, and Caleb watched it all with a heavy, quiet stillness. Knowing he hadn't saved the town, he'd only stopped lying to it. And when the sheriff finally arrived hours too late, there was no arrest to make that could undo what had been revealed, because power had already shifted. Because once a secret is dragged into daylight, it starts deciding things for itself. And as the sun sank low, painting the plains red as old blood, Caleb gathered the remaining papers and fed them to a fire, not to erase them, but to seal what they had done. Because truth doesn't need proof once it's seen. And when he mounted his horse to leave, no one stopped him, not because they feared him, but because they understood him, a man who had lost everything and refused to lose one thing more, his silence. And as he rode back toward his ranch, past land that no longer felt owned but earned, the town behind him fractured and rebuilding all at once. Voices raised not in anger now, but reckoning. Caleb knew the warning had never been about the box at all. It had been about what happens when one man decides he's done being controlled. And if you're listening to this story right now, if your heart's still pounding with dust and gun smoke and buried truth, then you already know why these stories matter. Why the Wild West was never just about outlaws, but about choices that echo forever. And that's why you should subscribe to this channel. Because we don't just tell stories here, we uncover them. One forbidden truth at a time. And some things were never meant to stay buried.